Growing up, I watched my father treat loyalty like a suggestion. He worked long hours at the plant, or so he told us, but the truth had a way of leaking through the walls of our small house in Akron. Lipstick on a collar. A receipt from a restaurant my mother had never been to. Phone calls that ended the moment she walked into the room. She never said a word about it, not to him, not to us. She just kept making dinner, kept ironing his shirts, kept smiling at church on Sunday mornings like everything was fine. I used to sit at the kitchen table watching her and think, how does she do it? How does she swallow all that pain and still pass the biscuits? I promised myself I would never be him. Not the lying, not the sneaking, and not the staying silent when silence was a kind of cowardice. I promised myself that if I ever built a life with someone, it would be built on something real. No cracks in the foundation, no rot underneath the floorboards. When I met my wife in my second year of college, I thought I had found exactly that. She was studying business administration, and she had this way of paying attention to you, really paying attention, like whatever you were saying was the only thing in the world that mattered right then. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. We married in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Columbus, and I remember standing there under that rented arch thinking I had done what my father never managed to do. I had chosen well. I had chosen right. For the first 11 years, I believed that completely. I worked as a project estimator for a mid-sized construction firm downtown. My wife had built a solid career in commercial real estate. We owned a house we were proud of, had 2 dogs, a good circle of friends, and the kind of life that looked from the outside like the result of 2 people who had made sensible decisions and respected each other. I was not naive. I knew marriages required work. We had gone through hard stretches, long patches of distance, disagreements about money, about her mother, about the fact that I spent too many weekends working on estimates instead of being present. But we always came back to each other. Or so I thought. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in my office going over bid sheets for a warehouse project when my cell phone rang. I did not recognize the number, but I picked up out of habit. The man on the other end introduced himself as Derek. He said he worked in the same commercial real estate office as my wife. He sounded careful, like someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now second-guessing whether to say it at all. I told him to go ahead. He told me that my wife had been spending a significant amount of time with a colleague named Paul Garrett, that they had been meeting for lunch almost every day. That earlier that morning, he had overheard them in the break room talking openly about a weekend trip they were planning. A cabin rental 2 hours north of the city, just the 2 of them, starting Friday evening. I asked him why he was telling me this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his own wife had been cheated on before they met and it had taken her a long time to recover. He said he would want someone to tell him. That was all. I thanked him and sat very still for about 4 minutes after we hung up. The first thing I felt was not anger. It was a strange, almost clinical clarity. The same feeling I get when I realize a set of numbers in a bid does not add up and I have to figure out exactly where the error is before the whole project goes sideways. I did not want to react. I wanted to know. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to an attorney a colleague of mine had used during his divorce 2 years prior. She agreed to see me the next morning. The second call was to a private investigator I found through a referral from that same attorney, a man named Gary who had a flat, unhurried way of speaking that I found reassuring. I met Gary at a coffee shop near my office. I told him what Derek had told me. He asked me a few quiet questions and then laid out a straightforward plan. He would begin surveillance that evening and continue through the weekend. He said he would have something for me by Sunday night. I drove home and pulled into the garage and sat there for several minutes before going inside. My wife was already home. She was in the kitchen reheating leftovers and she smiled at me when I walked in and asked how my day was. I told her it was fine. We ate dinner. We watched television. She fell asleep on the couch and I carried her to bed and lay awake beside her in the dark until nearly 3 in the morning. The next day I met with the attorney. She was a compact, no-nonsense woman named Carol who had been handling divorce cases for over 20 years. She listened without interruption while I explained the situation. When I finished, she said, "If what you've told me is accurate, the paperwork can be ready by the time you need it. But get the documentation first. Do not tip her off. Do not confront her yet. Let the investigator finish his work." I told her I understood. That Friday, my wife told me she had a work retreat over the weekend. A team-building thing, she said. She showed me the calendar invite on her phone. It looked real. A hotel in Cleveland, a company name, a time. She had prepared this carefully. I told her to have a good trip. I kissed her on the cheek. I watched her drive away. I did not sleep much that weekend. I worked on the warehouse bid, walked the dogs, and stared at the television without watching it. Gary checked in twice by text to let me know things were proceeding. I did not ask for details. I did not want them yet. Sunday evening, he called and told me he had what I needed. We met Monday morning. He handed me a sealed envelope and a flash drive and described the contents in a flat, professional tone. Photos from the parking lot of the cabin. Photos through a window with curtains that had not been fully closed. A timestamp on everything. He told me the man, Paul Garrett, had driven a black BMW registered to an address in the suburb where my wife's office was located. He told me they had arrived together Friday evening and left together Sunday afternoon. I thanked him. I drove to my office. I sat at my desk and held the envelope without opening it for a long time. Then I called Carol. She told me the papers were ready. I told her to serve them. I want to explain something about what I did next because people have asked me since whether it was petty, whether I was being cruel. I do not think I was. I think I was being honest. When I got home that Sunday evening and my wife walked through the door looking relaxed and refreshed, still carrying the small weekend bag she had packed on Friday, I did not slam the door in her face or throw her belongings into the front yard. I sat at the kitchen table and I waited. She said she was glad to be home. She asked if I had eaten. She said the retreat had been exhausting but productive. She mentioned the name, a coworker named Brittany, as if Brittany had been part of the weekend. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter and talked to me about nothing in particular, and I watched her and thought about my mother passing the biscuits. I asked her how the cabin was. The glass of water stopped halfway to her mouth. I told her I knew about the cabin. I told her I knew about Paul Garrett. I told her she did not need to explain anything to me right now, because my attorney had already been retained and the papers would be served within the next 48 hours. I told her calmly, without raising my voice, that I needed her to understand that this was not a conversation that could be walked back from. This was not a fight we were going to work through. She cried. She said it was a mistake. She said it had only happened once, meaning the weekend, and that it had been building for months, and that she had felt so disconnected from me, and that she had not been thinking clearly. She said all the things that people say when they are caught and frightened. I listened to all of it. Then I told her she could sleep in the guest room that night and that I would be speaking to our attorney in the morning. She asked me if I was serious. I told her I had never been more serious about anything in my life. She slept in the guest room. I did not sleep at all. Over the following days, the phone started ringing. Her mother called me twice, patient and sorrowful, telling me that her daughter was devastated and that people made mistakes and that a marriage was worth fighting for. My father-in-law called once. He did not try to argue. He just said he was sorry and hung up. Her best friend, a woman named Renata, who I had always liked, left me a long voicemail that I erased without finishing. And then there was her brother. Her brother Marcus was 2 years older than her, and we had always gotten along reasonably well. He was direct without being unkind, and he had never talked around things. He called me on a Thursday, 4 days after I had confronted my wife, and he asked if he could come by the house. I said yes. He sat at the kitchen table where I had confronted her, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said he was not going to try to talk me out of anything. He said he knew what the situation was and that he was not here to defend his sister. He said he was here because he wanted me to know that whatever I needed from him in the next few weeks, he would do his best to provide it. If I needed someone to talk to, if I needed to know that someone in her family actually understood what I was going through, he was that person. I was not expecting that. We sat there for a while. He asked me if I had eaten that day. I realized that I had not. He drove us to a diner 2 miles away, and we ate eggs and drank bad coffee and talked about other things entirely. Baseball mostly. And when he dropped me back at the house, he shook my hand and said, "For what it's worth, you were always the right kind of man for this family." She forgot that. I went inside and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time after that. The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks after the papers were served. My wife had retained an attorney who specialized in contested proceedings, which told me she intended to fight. Carol told me to prepare for a difficult session and to bring everything Gary had provided. I brought everything. We sat on opposite sides of a long conference table. My wife looked thinner than she had 3 weeks ago, and her attorney, a polished man named Whitfield, opened by suggesting that given the circumstances and the length of the marriage, both parties had contributed to the conditions that led to the current situation and that perhaps a structured separation with counseling might be a more constructive path forward. Carol looked at me. I nodded once. She reached into her folder and slid 3 photographs across the table, face down, and asked my wife's attorney to take a look. Whitfield turned them over. He kept his expression very professional, but he took a slow breath through his nose. My wife reached for the photographs. I watched her face go through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. Her attorney put a hand on her arm and spoke quietly to her, and she shook her head slightly and sat back. Then she said, in a voice that was very controlled, that none of this changed the fact that she believed the marriage could be repaired if both parties were willing to engage in good faith. Carol said, "My client is engaging in complete good faith right now, which is why he's prepared to move forward efficiently and without making this documentation public, provided we can reach an equitable agreement today." It took 2 more hours, but we reached one. The weeks after that had a strange, hollow quality to them. The house felt too large. The dogs were confused. I found myself going into the office early and staying late, not because there was more work, but because it was easier to exist in a space that had nothing personal in it. The warehouse project helped. Numbers are patient. They wait for you to work through them at whatever pace you can manage. Derek, the man who had made that first phone call, stopped by my office one afternoon. He did not make a big thing of it. He just knocked on the open door and asked how I was doing, and I told him honestly that some days were better than others. He said that was about right. He told me he had gone through something similar a few years before his current marriage, and that the first 6 months were the worst of it, and then it became something more manageable. I thanked him. We never talked about it again after that, but I found it meaningful that he had come by. Paul Garrett. I learned through a mutual contact in the real estate community, lost a significant client in the months following the divorce. Apparently, during the mediation process, certain information had made its way to that client's principal broker, a man with strong opinions about professional conduct among his network. I did not orchestrate that. I want to be clear about that. I did not make any calls. The real estate world in this city is smaller than it appears, and information moves through it the way water moves through old pipes. I was not surprised, but I was not responsible. My wife had moved in with a friend from her office while the divorce was being finalized. Marcus told me in one of our occasional conversations that she was not doing well. I asked him if she needed anything, whether it was practical or financial. He said she had what she needed. I said, "All right." About 4 months after the mediation, I took a week off and drove up to visit an old college roommate who lived outside of Asheville. He had a property up there with a decent-sized wood shop, and he had been after me for 2 years to come out and learn how to build something with my hands. I am an estimator by trade, which means I understand construction in the abstract, in measurements and material costs and labor hours. But I had never actually built anything myself. That week, we built a bookshelf. It took 4 days and turned out slightly uneven on one side, and I was more proud of it than almost anything I had done in years. His neighbor had a daughter visiting that week, a woman in her early 40s named Kathleen, who worked as a landscape architect and had driven up from Charlotte to help her father clear some land on the back of his property. She was quiet in the specific way that people who spend a lot of time outdoors tend to be quiet, comfortable with silence, not filling it with noise just to fill it. We had dinner together twice that week, the 4 of us, and on the last evening, she and I sat on the back porch after the others had gone inside and talked for a long time about nothing urgent, about work, about what Asheville had looked like before it became what it was now, about the particular smell of wood shavings and sawdust, and whether it was one of the best smells in the world or just in the top 10. She asked me what had brought me up here, and I told her the short version, the honest version, without the details that were no longer anyone else's business. She said she had gone through something similar 3 years ago, that the first year she had thrown herself so completely into work that her business had actually done better than ever, and she had found that mildly disturbing in retrospect. I said I understood that impulse entirely. She gave me her number before I left on Sunday morning. She said if I was ever in Charlotte for work, she knew a good place for barbecue. I said I happened to have a client in Charlotte I have been putting off visiting. She smiled at that. The drive home took me most of the day, and by the time I pulled into the garage, the house felt a little less like a place I was waiting to leave. I let the dogs in from the yard and fed them, and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Carol called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me simply that it was done. I thanked her and we said goodbye. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I called Derek and told him the news, and he said, good, now go get some dinner somewhere decent tonight. And I did. Marcus and I still have breakfast occasionally, on Saturday mornings at a place near his apartment. He never talks about his sister, and I never ask. We talk about the city, about his job, about a home renovation he has been putting off for 2 years. It is one of the stranger friendships I have in my life, and also one of the more honest ones. Some months after the divorce, I got a short message through a mutual contact. It was from my wife. It said only that she was sorry, that she had spent a long time thinking about it, and understood now what she had thrown away, and that she hoped I was well. There was no ask in it, no attempt to reopen anything, just the words. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down and took the dogs for a long walk. There is a version of this story where I fell apart, where the months after became defined by bitterness and rage and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being betrayed by someone you loved completely. I will not pretend that version did not exist for a while. It did. There were bad nights, bad mornings, a period of about 6 weeks where I was functioning, but not much more than that. But here's what I learned, or maybe what I already knew and needed to be reminded of, by watching my mother make her choice and then eventually make a better one. You do not have to carry what was done to you. You can set it down, not for the person who put it there, not as forgiveness in the way people usually mean that word, but for yourself. Because the weight of it costs you things you cannot afford to keep losing. I visited Kathleen and Charlotte about 2 months after I got back from Asheville. The barbecue was excellent. The company was better. The bookshelf is slightly uneven, and it is in my living room, and I look at it most mornings and find it, against all reasonable expectation, encouraging. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand or dramatic way, but in the quiet, practical way that you think about structural integrity when you're looking at a building that has started to lean. Things do not collapse without reason. They lean first. And if you are paying attention, the lean tells you everything you need to know before the collapse arrives. My wife made a series of choices. Each one followed from the last. She chose to pursue something she knew would cost her everything if it came to light. She chose to lie about it carefully and with preparation. She chose to sit across a conference table and deny it out loud to people who already knew the truth. And when the photos came out, the cost of all those choices arrived at once, the way debt does when you have been ignoring the balance long enough. I do not say that with satisfaction. I say it because it is simply what happened. The choices we make in private do not stay private. They find their way into conference rooms and kitchen tables and the expressions on people's faces when they realize the story they have been telling does not match the evidence in front of them. What I learned from all of it, and I mean learned in the way that actually changes how you move through the world, not just something you nod at and forget, is that integrity is not a performance. It is not something you display when people are watching. It is the thing you do when no one is watching, when the easier path is right there and no one would know if you took it. I had that tested. I chose not to confront her emotionally, not to cause a scene, not to act before I knew what I was actually dealing with. I stayed quiet and I stayed methodical, and I let the truth do what truth eventually does on its own. There is also something to be said for the intelligence of restraint. Not restraint as weakness, not swallowing things that should be said, but the specific discipline of knowing when to act and how. When Derek called me, I did not spiral. I got information. I made appointments. I thought through outcomes. That clarity, that refusal to be governed entirely by feeling in the worst moment of my adult life, was not something I was born with. It was something I had built slowly, imperfectly, over years of being the kind of person who tries to think before he reacts. It mattered more than I expected when it was finally needed. And resilience, the real kind, is not the absence of falling apart. I did fall apart, in the quiet, private way that does not show at the office or at dinner with a college friend, but that sits with you at 3 in the morning and does not leave easily. Resilience is what you do after that. It is driving to Asheville and building an uneven bookshelf and letting that be enough for a week. It is answering honestly when a woman you just met asks what brought you there. It is choosing, slowly, to let something new have a chance. Paul Garrett lost a client he had spent years building, not because I made a call, but because the world is connected and conduct has consequences that travel further than we intend. My wife sat in a mediation room and watched the story she had constructed dissolve in about 4 seconds. I did not engineer that moment for the drama of it. I brought the truth because the truth was what I had. That is the only revenge that ever made sense to me. Not cruelty, not spectacle, just accuracy. Just letting things be exactly what they are.